PowerPoint. All right, you should have a page in your notes that looks like this, right? You have that there? Today we're talking about a very, very complex idea that we're trying to simplify, at least to some degree, by virtue of this chart. And this is not original to me, this comes out of your book, actually. And I did add something at the bottom, but is that bottom section in your notes, this line with the dots on it? No. It's not there? Okay, and the purpose for that line, that continuum at the bottom, is just to serve as a reminder that there are lots and lots of variations to these positions, but these three positions at the top at least give us some basis of to initiate a conversation about them. Okay, there are quite a few notes to fill in, and by the way, I'm just probably going to give you the rest of the notes from the previous page. Okay, the five incontrovertible truths that we believe. We'll do that. I'll probably just give those to you because there's quite a bit to fill in here in this section. Holism and prioritism. Okay. When we use the word holism, we have to be careful that we don't think about what. Okay, yeah, it's not referring to what is holy, and we're not referring to a whole. Okay, it actually would be better if the word holism began with the letter W, because we're talking about that which is complete or entire. Okay, so the big issue when it comes to holism versus prioritism is what constitutes a whole or entire, complete gospel presentation. Okay, what is mission activity? Okay, in its whole form. To put it another way, how are we sure that we are fulfilling the whole Great Commission and not just part of it? That's the big debate. All right, and this isn't a debate that began, a decade or two ago. This has been going on for a long, long time. Okay, so you can see, I'll just read through these with you, and then we'll go into a little more detail. Liberation theology is fairly new on the scene. And when I say that, I mean it became popular in the middle of the last century, middle of the 1900s. It's amazing how many things in missions kind of popped up in the middle of the 20th century. Very interesting. Whole science of missiology, okay, and this idea of liberation theology is more geographically limited than some other things we're going to talk about. Okay, so this is the radical holism. If you're going to put holism on a scale, this is radical holism. Mission is to promote justice in society and establish shalom on the earth. Now, you guys have heard an earful about justice, right, in the news. Is the justice that's being propagated right now in society the same as the justice here? When you hear the word justice from a political vantage point, what comes to your mind? What kind of justice is being proposed? Yeah.
Justice for LGBTQ.
Okay. Obviously, one of the groups that rises front and center and that is really driving a lot of this is that what other movement has had a lot to do with the justice emphasis now?
Critical race theory?
Okay, critical race theory, which is very much tied to what popular movement that came up?
BLM.
Yeah, right. Black Lives Matter movement, okay. Critical race theory, we could spend a lot of time talking about that. There are similarities between the justice emphasis now and this, but there is a fundamental difference. The main emphasis on justice in liberation theology has to do with evil, tyrannical, unjust governments. And the hotbed of liberation theology was, when you're reading what part of the world, what geographical part of the world?
South America?
Pardon?
South America?
Yeah, Latin America. We take. I mean, you used to study Central and South America. Now it's pretty much just North and South. Even Mexico. I think you're aware of this. Mexico, geographically, is actually considered part of North America, but ethnically, politically, otherwise, is more associated with Latin America. Okay, South America. So that doesn't mean that liberation theology means nothing to other people living in other places, okay? But it really began there. In fact, the guy who really popularized liberation theology in the U.S. has the last name of my son-in-law. My daughter married a guy named Wade Gutierrez. And Gutierrez is the name of the guy. So I don't have any problem remembering who popularized liberation theology. All I got to do is think of my son-in-law. Poor guy.
Wow.
He told me once. He told me once that Gutierrez is, and he would roll it when Gutierrez.
Yes.
Yeah, he would say that it means Smith in Spanish. I don't know. Probably depends on which country. Is that a name that
I
you're
mean, I
aware
don't
of?
know if it means it. It's one of the most popular names.
Mhm.
So like,
He wasn't saying it means Smith. He was saying it's that popular.
yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Gutierrez, Martinez, Fernandez, Gonzalez. Those are like the main ones.
Yeah, no, he's from Mexico. I mean, he's not, but his ancestors are. Okay, so liberation theology. Okay, yeah,
You record?
I am. Thank you. I thank you for reminding me, but I am recording this thing. I actually remember it all by my lonesome. That doesn't happen every day. Liberation theology says that when the Bible talks about salvation, redemption, that type of thing, the emphasis, at least that we should place today on this subject, is political. You could say socio-political. Okay. Now, what red flags come flying in your mind right away if I say that? Look, when we read the Bible, we read about deliverance and salvation, redemption. It's really political. What comes to your mind? Am I right? Is that what the Bible's getting at? Didn't God? Yeah.
Jesus kept saying his kingdom wasn't of this world.
Okay, yeah, he told Pilate just before his death, my kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my disciples would fight for me. Yeah. What else? Didn't God deliver Israel from a tyrannical political system in Egypt and redeem them from the hand of Pharaoh? Wasn't their redemption political? So maybe you have a point.
I think one thought that kind of brings up is if the Bible is all about redemption from like political redemption, then that means that the main storyline of the Bible and the main enemy is a tyrannical dictator, and the main problem centers around humans not relating to each other right, instead of humans not humans being in sin before God, which actually makes all of Christianity about man instead of about God.
Okay, good. Yeah, it does humanize the whole thing, and that's exactly what happens with liberation theology. God is basically left out of the picture, and God may be part of the picture, but we need to trust God to overthrow this evil, wicked, tyrannical government. Okay. What does the book of Hebrews call the things in the Old Testament that look forward to things that were to come? Shadows. Okay, we call them. There's a theological term we use for those two. What is that? Typology, right? And the type is always inferior to the antitype. The shadow is inferior to the real thing. And so even though there is political significance to what God did in delivering Egypt, the type that was to come was greater and much more inclusive, and it had a spiritual impact. Okay, so the Passover and the deliverance that Israel as a nation experienced from Egypt was not intended to be political in an ongoing fashion. It was intended to represent something much greater that God was going to do. Now, when Jesus comes back, there will be a kingdom. There will be politics involved, you see, because he's going to establish a millennial kingdom. But the problem is, liberation theology has isolated God's plan of deliverance and salvation and made it this. And I notice I put the word social gospel here at the bottom because at this same time is when the social gospel was really blossoming in America. And so a social gospel is intimately tied to liberation theology because it's all about society and politics. Okay? And what church in Latin America really got behind this and promoted it? No brainer. What's the dominant church in Latin America? Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church became infested with this whole idea of liberation theology. Okay, now, gotta move. Okay, holism theology. Let's fill in some blanks here. Letter A in your notes is liberation theology. It's uprising in Latin American Catholicism. That's that next blank. Latin American Catholicism. Its relation to, now, guess here with me. What increasingly popular political ideology could easily blend in with liberation theology? What was happening in Eastern Europe and the USSR? Yeah, but let's use the word Marxism, which actually didn't begin there. But yeah, the Marxism. Marxism believed in equality. With a classless society. It preached, doing away with tyranny and all that. So the rise of Marxism and communism, that concept really facilitated and gave fuel to the whole liberation theology movement. 3, its understanding of sin and salvation. So help me out. What would sin be?
Being the oppressor in any sort of way.
Bingo. Did you hear the word he just used? Oppression. Have you heard that word anytime recently in the news? It's all over the place. And look, and gentlemen, if you're a white male, you are pretty much an oppressor. And if you don't realize it, you need to go through therapy classes to understand that. I mean, there are reiterations of this whole thing going on right now in our society. A little different clothing, a little different emphasis, but same underlining. And salvation then would be deliverance from these oppressive governments, movements, or whatever. Okay. By the way, have you noticed today how many evangelical people, nominal Christians, are caving in to the moral revolution? And part of that is because, they're not well grounded in the scriptures, and so they're easy prey for this kind of thinking. Number 4, it's emphasis on socio-political issues. Socio-political issues. Right? Well, let me ask you this. What is it that makes liberation theology so easy to embrace as opposed to understanding salvation in its spiritual sense? Why is it so attractive? Yeah.
The majority of people are the victims instead of the sinners.
Yeah, people are victims, and the world is full of victims. And just to take one other step, this type of salvation hits us right where we're living today. It is tangible, it's visible. You understand what I'm saying? This is a kind of oppression that deals with the senses, the way we're made, and what we experience and live right now. Whereas spiritual salvation of the soul, is something beyond that that's not as obvious at first glance. Cody?
I can definitely see how people relate to it. They can relate their lives that they have been living to what's going on.
Right. Even think of people who go on missions trips. What do you like to be able to come back from mission trips and say, we did that, we gave this, we did that, we'd like to be able to give tangible evidence that this trip was worthwhile and we accomplished something. And that's not wrong. I'm just saying that this helps us to understand why something like this is so horribly attractive. Okay? All right, holism. Okay, there are two kinds of holism here that are stated. Now, revisionist holism, we are definitely not going to get through all the no's, but all right. Revisionist holism, it says the mission is to minister to society and individuals without dichotomizing between the physical and the spiritual, or the body and the soul spirit. We do that, right? When you think of ministry, you naturally think of two kinds of ministry. There's spiritual ministry, and then there's physical/social ministry, material, financial, whatever. But revisionist holism says we need to completely eliminate those differences. Okay? It's all, man is one being, all these things are part of the same. But restrained holism says the mission is to minister to society and individuals socially while giving a certain priority to evangelism. In other words, restrained holists, according to Hesselgrave, would say, no, they're not exactly the same. I mean, the social is important, but we do need to give a little bit more emphasis to the spiritual salvation of the soul. Okay? So filling in these, number one is revisionist holism. Evangelism and social action are full and equal partners. That's the second. That's the number one there. They're full and equal partners. There really isn't any distinction. And they would cite Jesus in the Gospels and say, Jesus made no distinction. He healed people, okay? He fed people, but he also taught spiritual truth to people. I mean, you don't see that dichotomy in the ministry of Jesus. Would you agree with that? I mean, just be honest. If you're doing a cursory reading of the Gospels, it's really, really hard to dichotomize them. The feeding, miracles that Jesus performed, okay, very, very much tied to his spiritual message. Now, we're going to come back to that in just a minute, okay, because that is an important thing. All right, now, number two, under revisionist holism, is, and what's the big word that we use to talk about peace in the world, and shalom. Now, you have to understand, if you study Hebrew, shalom means peace, okay? It also is a greeting. Shalom when you meet somebody, shalom when you say goodbye. But that's not what shalom means in this context, okay? Shalom here is the broad peace that God wants to accomplish on earth. And part of that is by the undoing of tyrannical governments and unjust social situations, right? To bring about this peace. So, help me out here. In terms of your eschatology, what you believe about the future, is liberation theology primarily a premillennial approach to the future? Postmillennial? Amillennial? Because this is an important factor. Yeah.
I think I'd see it as post-millennial because they're trying to usher in the kingdom and bring that justice
Exactly.
through the church or man's effort.
Exactly. The priority of God's people, the church, is to usher in this kingdom. So everything that we do, every effort we make to help people overcome poverty and poor education and poor health and poor governments is ushering in the kingdom. So I've said this in other classes, and I like to say it because it's so important. Your eschatology does impact your missiology. I hope that you guys will really develop a love for eschatology. 25% of the Bible is eschatology, and only half of that, 1/8, has actually been fulfilled. There's a ton of eschatology. And we who are dispensational here at Faith, okay, not just at Faith, but I'm dispensational personally, we champion a literal, grammatical hermeneutic. Interpretation. At the bottom of all of this is your hermeneutic. What you believe about Bible interpretation is going to land you in one of these positions. And it's going to land you in your eschatology. It's very, very important. If you believe that the role of the church is to prepare the earth for the coming of the kingdom of Christ, or to bring it in some way, you're going to land somewhere on the left side of this chart. It's so important. I just want to really encourage you to get a hold of your hermeneutic and your eschatology. covenant theology, replacement theology, reformed theology is based on a hermeneutic that is much more given to an allegorical, or at least permissive allegorical interpretation than literal grammatical historical. I'm just telling you. So important you get that down. You might ask, well, why is it that Christian people can be so broad? That's what it comes down to, okay? We'll come back to that too. I may take 2 class periods, I don't know. Nothing says I have to get through all of these. Number 2, restrained priority. Okay, number 1, evangelism has somewhat higher in priority over social action. That's number 1, priority. And 2, the Lausanne Covenant of 1974, Lausanne. Lausanne. That is a very important historical mission convention that took place in 1974 that really placed an emphasis on the role of evangelism in missions work. You say that wasn't that obvious to us? It should be obvious, but it hasn't been obvious to evangelicals all along the way. When the social gospel came in the early 1900s, late 1800s, it really, really did damage to the way people think about missions. Okay, so this conference, 1974, was a reiteration of the priority of evangelism, but still had a holistic tint, the need for social gospel stuff. Number 3, John Stott's focus on John 20:21. Now, let me just skip to this. Here's John 20:21. It's the John version of the Great Commission, right? How do you understand the phrase, as the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you? Flesh that out a little bit for me. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. Develop that for me. The key word here is as. What does Jesus mean by the word as? As the Father has sent me.
In the same way.
In the same way? Okay, keep going. How did the Father send him? Sorry. This is very important. Let me give you 2 options. Does this mean, just like the Father sent me, he sent me, so I'm sending you? In other words, emphasis on the fact of being sent. God sent me, I'm sending you. That's one interpretation. Stott suggested another interpretation. That was a little different. In the same way that God sent me to do what I did, he is sending you.
There's a more emphasis on the way that he was sent than on the person.
And the mission that he was sent to accomplish. As the Father sent me to heal, raise the dead, to feed people, perform miracles, signs and wonders, okay? So I am sending you to do likewise. You see the difference? And that's the interpretation that Stott landed on. And Stott's a good guy overall, okay? I disagree with that, okay? And I think it's in a later discussion we're going to actually talk about that. Okay. Let me see if I have room for that on the class calendar here, because there's so much in Hasselgrave that's good. We could take the whole. By the way, Dr. Ken Rathman teaches current issues in missiology on the seminary level, and he uses Hasselgrave's book. And so, if any of you end up going to seminary, you'll probably you'll jump into more of those. Let me just see. Yeah, in fact, the very next one's going to get into that more. So I won't waste time here on that. Okay. For a lot of reasons that we don't have a lot of time to go into, I take the position that Jesus is not talking about what he did. Okay, I just have to make this word of explanation. A lot of what Jesus did was unique to him. Why? What was his purpose in coming? What was his mission? I mean, I know he came to die, but what what were characteristics of Jesus' mission that would not be characteristics of our mission?
Offering the kingdom to Israel.
Okay, we don't offer the kingdom. He did that. Think about what he did in order to demonstrate his identity.
Miracles.
Miracles. John uses the word sign, semeion. Okay, some of you take Greek, semeion, sign, exclusively in reference to the messianic signs that Jesus performed. Now, he used the word works, to refer to what the disciples would do. And even what he did too, he did works. But John reserves the word signs for Jesus' specific, unique, messianic signs, like raising the dead, feeding, healing. Isaiah said that the lame would run like a deer, leap like a deer, right? Okay. So if Jesus is saying here, I'm sending you to do the same thing that God sent me to do, the Father sent me to do, we got a problem. Because now we're expected to do signs and wonders. And as we speak here in this class this morning, there is a huge emphasis on signs and wonders movement out there in missiology. And it's based on, guess what? Your hermeneutic, your interpretation of these things. The hermeneutics is so very important. You guys, is there a course here on hermeneutics, or is that something that you study in conjunction with like intro to Bible study? Is there a course actually just on hermeneutics you study here? No?
No.
Maybe there is on the seminary level. Man, it's so important. It is so very, very important. Okay, so this is part of what's driving this. So people who are in the signs and wonders movement, or the people who would embrace a holistic, theology approach to missions would say, we're followers of Jesus. And therefore, we imitate Jesus. Didn't Paul say, be imitators of Jesus Christ? He did. Was he saying that without any restrictions, saying that everything that Jesus did and said we should imitate? Well, if we do that, essentially we're proclaiming ourselves to be messiahs. It just doesn't fit in the context of Scripture. Paul was definitely talking about the character of Christ, but not talking about all of the messianic signs that he performed. They were unique to him. Okay? That's really, really important. Okay. Then traditional prioritism, which is on the purple one over there, says, number one, evangelism is the primary mission of the church, and social action as, and I like this word, supportive. I think Hesselgrave really hit the nail on the head here. We are not saying that there's no place for helping people with food needs. Missionary nursing would be out the window if we took an extreme position on this, right? We do believe that there's a place for social involvement and material help in the world of missions, because man is a unit. He is made of the immaterial and the material, body, soul, and spirit, or whatever, body, soul, spirit. Okay? But what we are saying is that those things that we do materially and socially, or politically or whatever, are only there to support the ultimate message of salvation that people need. Okay? Because we're not preaching a kingdom that we're bringing in. We're preaching. If we were bringing in the kingdom, would the Bible call us strangers and pilgrims? If we were here as vice regents bringing in the kingdom of God, I don't think the Bible would refer to us as strangers and pilgrims. Strangers and pilgrims are passing through. They're not here to establish a kingdom. See the difference? It's very, very important. Okay. All right. Number two. Oh, by the way, just let me say this. It is hard to know sometimes what the limits are on social action. If you are, this morning our speaker, referred to the dichotomy between our riches here in America and the poverty of people in other worlds. By the way, I don't think that should heap guilt upon us. If God has blessed us with abundance, we should thank him for it and use that abundance for his glory. Okay, so I don't think it should bring guilt on us, a shame on us for being so well off and so, no. But the point is, it is challenging when you go to a third world country economically you are going to be viewed as rich no matter what you say. I've tried to get out of that, and it doesn't work. They're looking right through your words and saying, to drive, look where you come from. You're a rich American. I learned not to try and overturn their opinion. What I decided to do is I got to use what I have. In fact, I bought a car once when it was a financial crunch in Brazil one year, and I actually had to buy a simpler car. And at least two of my prominent members, one who became our pastor later, and a lady who was from a political background, were very uncomfortable with that car we had. And after a while, we were able to buy something a little bit better. And they breathed a sigh of relief and told me, when you had that car, it really bothered us. I said, why? They said, you're an American. We expect you to live differently. I thought, that's interesting. I thought I'd be bonding with them by coming down to their level. So this dichotomy is not necessarily our enemy. The question is not, how do I lower myself to become equal economically to them? The question is, how do I use what God has given me in order to bring glory to his name and help them? How much you help without creating dependence, that's tough. One of the biggest challenges of missionaries is to know how much do we help people with material things without creating the wrong impression, drawing people for the wrong motives, or creating dependency. There's not an easy answer to that question. It just isn't. And every missionary is going to give you a little bit different, depending on the circumstances that they're in. We get a little different angle on that. Okay? So anyway, all right. Number 2, the World Congress on Evangelism, which took place in 1966. You can see that was just before the Lausanne Conference. That also placed probably even a stronger emphasis on evangelism than the Lausanne Conference did, okay? And Billy Graham was a big deal. In fact, that World Congress, Billy Graham became kind of the poster child for that. Now, I realize that we don't agree with everything about Billy Graham. He had some associations we'd have a problem. But one thing you cannot take away from Billy Graham is that he preached the gospel of Jesus Christ unconditionally. I mean, he did. And what else he did, we could debate. But he became the poster child for that conference. Evangelism, winning people to Christ. That's what we're about. Okay? All right, Hesselgrave's criticism of holism, number 2. And we'll just get started. I am going to come back to this next class. His criticism of holism. A, the claim that holism allows for no priorities. He takes issue with that, and so do I. I do not have a problem with the concept of holism because I do not believe that the only thing we do as followers of Jesus is preach a spiritual gospel. We are, look at the early church. Did they not sell lands and do things in order to help those? But one thing you should keep in mind is that in Acts 2 and Acts 4, that sharing of goods and money was in the context of church. They were not using it as an evangelistic tool. Now, I'm not saying they never did help people. All I'm saying is that both passages that emphasize that voluntary sharing of goods was in the context of the local church. Okay? Just keep that in mind. And that's one thing you do have to be careful of because, you know the old saying, what you win them with is what you win them to, right? So, if you use material things in order to draw people in, you're going to have to sustain that after they're in. But anyway, he takes issue with that. Letter B, his argument for reason, and I think we've kind of done that just now. We have argued from reason, and his argument from revelation. What does the Bible teach about our priority? Have you ever noticed, and we will get to this in the next one, have you ever noticed that even though in the ministry of Jesus, you see a blending of material and spiritual activity, when it comes to the epistles and the Apostle Paul and the message of the early church, the emphasis is clearly on the message of the redemptive work of Christ, right? His death and resurrection. That becomes the emphasis. And even the collection that Paul is taking up, along the way in his second and third missionary journeys are for whom? The church, the poor saints in Judea that are suffering. And I think he's actually using that as a way of binding the Gentiles and the Jews together because that's a huge issue in the early church. And so the Gentiles are taking up offerings that are going to be a blessing to their Jewish brethren. His prayer is that they will be acceptable. In fact, in Romans 15, he says, pray that this will be acceptable to the saints. And apparently they did accept it graciously. Okay? So, all right. There are two key passages that we're going to look at, and we'll have to get in. Let me just introduce the passage. The first one, let me just read this first about liberation theology. This comes from the source you can see below. There can be no doubt that recent events, this is written in 2020, okay? Recent events have rekindled interest in Latin American liberation theology. Let me stop there. Some people have said that liberation theology is a thing of the past. It had its heyday in the 1950s, 60s. Now it's, but this guy believes that there is a resurgence of interest. The election of Pope Francis, the critique of capitalism in his encyclical Evangelii Gaudium in 2013, and his turn to ecological concerns in Laudato Si, echo the economic and environmental focus of theologians such as Gutierrez and Boff, and other guys really into liberation theology. Indeed, last year's Amazon Synod and the clamor for reform of the Curia confirm the importance of liberationary approaches to ecology and radical ecclesiology. Similarly, secular social movements such as those against feminicide, interesting word, and for the decriminalization of abortion have precipitated considerable advances in women's theology in Latin America while building on the base constructed by early liberation theologians. Basically, what he's saying is look around and see what's going on. You know, the green movement, the environmental movement, okay? What else did he mention here? Well, abortion, decriminalizing that. All of these things are drawing attention to another form of salvation, not in the same way that happened back in the 50s, but it is a resurgence of that concept. So anyway, we'll look at these two passages in Isaiah and Luke next time. I know that it means we will have to miss some other things, but this is a hugely important. You serve God in Latin America, especially, or, you know, you will. All right, thanks, guys.